guys, it's Cece and welcome to my February wrap-up. In this video, I'm going to be wrapping up all of the books that I read in February. There are a grand total of 7. Oh, actually before we jump in, I want to check off a couple of my monthly goals and tell you what I read to accomplish those. I just had to deconstruct my pile, which is making me sad. But the monthly challenges that I've set for myself. So the first of those is that I have to read at least one 2017 new release every single month. I actually accomplished this 3 times over in February. 3 of the books I read were books that were released in 2017. So we have Amberlough by Lara, Elena, Donnelly, which was released in February. We Are Okay by LaCour, also released in February. And Peter Darling by Austin Chant, also released in February. So these were all 2017 February releases that I read this month. Definitely checked off that goal. And the other thing that I'm working on is getting through my top 15 to read in 2017 TBR. I checked off 2 of those books this month. So I read In Cold Blood by Truman Capote, which was on my list. And I read A Court of Thorns and Roses by Sarah J. Maas. So that is 2 books off of that list as well, but now let's get into reviews. So the very first book that I read in the month of February was Amberlough by Lara, Elena, Donnelly. I have a full spoiler-free review of this book up on my channel if you'd like to go check that out for more of my thoughts, again, sans spoilers, but let me tell you a little bit about what this is about. So this is a fantasy book, not in that there is magic, but in that it takes place in an imaginary world. It takes place in a world that is sort of inspired by 1930s Berlin. It's very heavy on cabaret and just that sort of vibe. It follows a spy named Cyril, and in this world there is this rise of a fascist regime called the Auspies, or the One-State Party. Cyril is not on the Auspies side because they are ultra-conservative, and actually Cyril is gay, and his lover Aristide actually works at a cabaret. But Cyril's cover gets blown on a mission, and in order to protect himself and Aristide, he ends up having to sort of turncoat and work for the Auspies. And in order to do this, they bring in the assistance of a nightclub dancer. Her name is Cordelia Lehane, and it's all about survival and spies, and yeah. If you go watch my review, you will find out that I really enjoyed this book, although it was very slow going at the start. It takes about 100 pages or so before you start to really get invested in the characters and the story. However, once you get used to the world and what's going on, and once the action really gets going, I think that these 3 main characters, Cyril, Aristide, and Cordelia, really support the world that they are in. They are fascinating to read about, they are layered, and I love the romance between Aristide and Cyril. It's written really well. This book does take a turn for the very dark by the time you get to the end, but I think it works along with the story, and overall, I highly recommend this book. If you haven't heard of it before, then I think you should definitely check it out, and I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. The next book that I read in February was my reread, and that is Queen of the Tearling by Erika Johansen. It was originally in my TBR that I was going to read this entire trilogy, but that did not happen, sorry. I had a way overly ambitious TBR for February, and it didn't happen. This is the first book in the Queen of the Tearling trilogy. It follows a girl named Kelsey who is 19 years old. She has been raised on the outskirts of this society with the expectation that once she comes of age, she will go and she will reclaim her throne because she is the rightful queen of the Tearling. However, there are a lot of things standing in her way once she actually comes of age, and these Queen's Guards come to collect her, to take her back to her kingdom. A lot of people want to kill her, basically. This is a super political high fantasy novel that I adore. The first time I read it, I gave it 4.5 stars, but upon a reread, I gave it a full 5. I just think it is masterfully written, and I think Kelsey is one of my favorite female characters of all time. A lot of people are thrown off by this, but this takes place in a regressed society, so it does take place way in our future, but it has been regressed to, like, the state of medievalness, I suppose, and there is magic involved. It's just political, it's intelligent. Kelsey is fierce, but also questioning, and the people around her are really well written. It's such a beautiful collection of characters and a world that I cannot wait to find out more about. I've read the second book as well, but I haven't finished the trilogy yet, and I'm just excited to find out how the series concludes, because this is fantastic, which is why, like I said, I upped my rating to 5 stars. Next up, we have We Are Okay by LaCour. I also have a spoiler-free review of this up on my channel. I just barely posted it if you would like to go check that out. This book was sent to me unsolicited by Penguin Teen, and Amberlough was sent to me by Tor, by the way. just so you know. But We Are Okay follows a girl named Marin, and she is dealing with grief. It takes place over the winter break of her first semester at college. She was raised in California, but has since moved to New York to go to school, and while the campus is completely empty, she is waiting for her best friend Mabel to arrive, which means that she's going to have to face a lot of the things that she ran from when she lost someone very close to her. This book beautifully examines grief, which is something I talk about extensively in my spoiler-free review, but I just think that the breakdown of Marin as a character and how she processes all of the things that come along with grief, it's just done really well. Nina LaCour's writing is always exquisite. This is my third book by her, and I just think that she is an incredible writer. I did have a few issues with this book in terms of believability. There are a lot of moments where Marin and Mabel come across these people who just offer them unsolicited life advice that like changes their outlook on how things will be going forward, and that's always a plot device that really frustrates me because I don't see it as particularly realistic, and those moments had a tendency to pull me out of the story. But I think that the emotion of this book is really well dealt with, as well as the fact that both Marin and Mabel are queer, though we don't get labels for either of them as to how they identify, and Mabel, the best friend, is Latinx, and there's a lot of good stuff going on here. There are some weaknesses in the middle. I think it takes a bit to get going, but the second half is fabulously done. I wound up giving this book a 3.5 star because I couldn't quite get into the beginning, but overall, I still definitely recommend it. The next book that I read in February was Brown Girl Dreaming by Jacqueline Woodson. This was also sent to me by Penguin Teen, actually, but it was back in December, so thanks to Penguin Teen. This is a non-fiction book told in verse. It is just about Jacqueline Woodson's time growing up as a black girl, both in the South and then in Brooklyn, and it's really well done. So it takes place in the 60s and 70s, and I think that the biggest strength of this book is the way that Jacqueline Woodson sets a scene. The poetry in here is so lush and descriptive, and it makes you feel like a part of the world she's describing. I marked a few of my favorite poems in here with little sticky tabs, if you can see them on the deckled edges there, but there's stuff like Our Names was one of my favorites. There's one about day work and the work that Jacqueline Woodson's grandparents were forced to do that her grandmother never wanted her to have to do. And one of my other favorites is Halfway Home #1, which is just about the fact that Jacqueline spent a lot of time growing up in the South, and then when she was a little bit older, she moved to Brooklyn, and she just feels this thing within her that she doesn't really know where home is, and it's beautiful. I don't read a lot of poetry, so I can't really comment on the structure or how well done the poetry itself was, but as a story, as an examination of her life, I really appreciated this. Plus, I was reading it alongside a lot of the research I'm doing for my thesis. So while this book is about her time in the 60s and 70s, I was focusing on 1980s Black feminism specifically in February. I was doing a ton of research on it for my thesis, and this just complemented that really well. I loved how I got to back up the research I was doing with some firsthand experience. There was just a lot about this book that worked really well for me for February. Plus, it was Black History Month, and so the research I was doing along with this book it was a good month to do all of this stuff in. I wound up giving this book 4 out of 5 stars, and I actually get to meet Jacqueline Woodson in March. She's coming to my campus. Hopefully, I'll be able to read another Brooklyn by the time she comes, but if she doesn't, Janelle has a copy and I can read it a little bit later, but loved this. After that, I picked up A Court of Thorns and Roses by Sarah J. Maas. So many of you assumed I was going to hate this, and I don't really know why you all assumed I was going to hate this, but I didn't. So this book follows a girl named Feyre. She is 19, I believe, and one day while she is out hunting for her family, she kills a wolf who turns out to be a fairy. And due to some very ancient laws, as retribution for this act, another fairy comes and takes her from her world into his. She's forced to live there and learn the world. Yeah, this is a Beauty and the Beast retelling, but with fairy elements, which I'm sure everyone knows about this book. So here are my thoughts on A Court of Thorns and Roses and why I enjoyed it for specific reasons. 100% I recognize that the romance in this book is abusive and not to be idealized. I don't support it. I recognize the power imbalances in their relationship and it's not good. Beyond that, Sarah J. Maas has a long history of having an overwhelmingly white cast in all of her books, an overwhelmingly heterosexual cast in all of her books, and those are both huge issues as well, which I was calling attention to while I was reading, which I was being critical of. However, while I do not support those elements, I did enjoy the process of reading this book as sort of just a fun escape. To me, I read this book the way I read Twilight. I don't support the relationships, but sometimes because I am old enough to recognize problematic elements in books, I'm able to go, this is not okay, but I'm going to read it and have fun and try to ignore those things while also being critical of them, which is essential if you're going to talk about a book that you like that has really questionable elements. You have to be able to recognize those elements and call them out, and then you can enjoy the book. But you can't just ignore that they're there. So that is my spiel on A Court of Thorns and Roses. I did really like Feyre. I thought she was an interesting character. I thought that she went through a really interesting journey. There were moments when I questioned her, but overall, I thought she was a pretty interesting character. Plus, this is a YA book that features fairly explicit sex scenes, which is a thing that I value. Just because YA that doesn't acknowledge that sex exists is really frustrating, so I appreciated that aspect even if the relationship itself was questionable. And yeah, I don't know, I liked it. I enjoyed it. I thought it was fun to read. I thought the second half was just like, it took on a life of its own, and I couldn't believe some of the stuff that was happening. And I'm really excited to read the second book, which is a Hades and Persephone retelling. So yeah, I enjoyed it. 4 out of 5 stars. After that, I read a book called Peter, Darling by Austen Chant. Now, the thing that I've decided to do recently is that when I'm trying to go to sleep, I tend to spend way too much time on my computer or on my phone, and so to try to combat that, I am reading 2 books at once from now on, a physical book that I read during the day, and then an ebook that I read after my girlfriend has laid down and gone to sleep, and I can just read on my Kindle until I go to sleep. I just think it's a healthier way to do things. It keeps me off social media, so I'm trying to read more ebooks now. I'm reading ebooks at the same time that I read physical books. Yeah. Peter, Darling is an Own Voices trans retelling of Peter Pan with male-male romance elements. If you thought you'd never hear that description of a book, I'll be honest, neither did I. So in this retelling of Peter Pan is trans and he has spent his life growing up as Wendy, but when he goes to Neverland, he can become his actualized self and take on that new identity as who he wants to be. And this story takes place like years or so after the original Peter Pan story. So Peter has grown up, he's a grown man, and he runs away from his family because they don't accept his trans identity, and he runs away from them and he comes back to Neverland, and over the course of the story has a romance with Captain Hook. This book made Peter Pan as a character so much more interesting to me. I've always sort of liked the Peter Pan story, but I've never had that much passion for it, and this did such a good job of balancing the magical elements of Neverland that I recognize while adding a lot of really new stuff. My favorite part about this was definitely Peter as a character, the way his brash, cockiness, and tendency to run into dangerous situations was balanced with his fear of his own identity, his fear of self. It just made him really, really fascinating, and I loved that. The thing that I had the hardest time getting over was the Hook-Pan romance. This is a pretty short book. It's like 150 or so pages, and so I don't think that we got enough character development to really establish how Hook and Pan are suddenly in a relationship. Plus, I was having a very hard time not picturing Dustin Hoffman a la Hook as Hook, which made the experience very, very strange to read because there are explicit sex scenes between the two of them. By the end, I had adjusted to the relationship, but at least initially, it was kind of hard to make my brain accept that this was a thing that was happening. So I loved the world and I loved Peter, and I came to like the romance, but that was a little bit of a struggle to get over initially. I wound up giving this book a 3.5 out of 5 stars. It came out in February. I do recommend that you check it out. It's Own Voices, and I think that shows. And I really want to read another one of Austen Chant's books, Coffee Boy. I believe that's also a trans male-male romance. So those are my thoughts on that. I hope that I have given you some idea of what this book is about. Definitely one that I'll be recommending in the future. And the final book that I read in February was In Cold Blood by Truman Capote. So this is a true crime nonfiction story. It is about the Clutter family who were brutally murdered in 1959 in Kansas. It was a mother, a father, and their 2 children, and they were each brutally murdered in a different part of their home. And this follows the investigation of that murder, the eventual capture of the people who committed the crime. This is incredibly well researched, but I was bored out of my mind reading it. I really tried. It took me half a month to read this while I read like so many more of these books, and I couldn't get into it. I think that Truman Capote could have cut this book down by like 100 pages with the extraneous details that he goes into that are completely irrelevant to the story. I just didn't end up enjoying it. And while the mystery itself, when we were actually hearing about the mystery, was fascinating, and I loved hearing how they solved it, the mentality of the killers, all of that was really great, but I was bored to tears reading this book, and so I gave it 2.5 out of 5 stars. I do, however, highly recommend the movie Capote, which is actually about the writing of In Cold Blood, so it's about Truman Capote doing the research, and that's really fascinating. I enjoyed that a lot more than I enjoyed this book. Anyway, there you go. Those are my thoughts on all of the books that I read in the month of February. If you have read any of these books and you have thoughts about them, please let me know what those thoughts are down in the description below. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you in another video very soon. Bye!